All right, first part of the build. Let me start it off by saying that I immediately broke into the manual because I had forgotten that Axial provides you with a few extra parts, as well as I very much underestimated the complexity of it. There's different style end links, as well as these red pieces can be mounted either direction, so you could spin them around 180 degrees. It just ended up being more complicated than I thought, so I immediately turned to the manual. The manual's been really good so far. Let's take a minute to talk about some of the stuff that we're going to need. Since this is the kit, you need a radio, a receiver for that radio, a speed control, a servo, a battery charger, a motor. It's all stuff you're going to need. I'll talk about what I'm running in a later video. Also, I thought they provided you with most of the tools, but looking around, it looks like they just give you a 4-way wrench thing. So I believe that'll cover your socket drivers. It's also listing you need a 1.5 millimeter, a 2.0 millimeter, and a 2.5. So far, I've used a 1.5 and a 2.0. I haven't used the 2.5 yet, but there might be something for it. It's nice to have these screwdrivers. You can just use an Allen wrench if you want, or sometimes it's nice to have a bit to go in a drill. That can speed it up, but you need to be careful. If you're trying to drill it into plastic, you can strip it. I recommend some side cutters. That's mostly to cut the parts off of the tree. The modeling knife, that or an X-Acto knife, that'd also be for cutting stuff off of the tree. The curved scissors, I believe that's for cutting out the body. My preferred tool for cutting out the body is tin snips. Needle nose pliers, those are always come in handy. I don't believe I've actually used those yet, but those probably will come in handy. They do include thread lock, grease, and shock oil, so that's nice of them. This goes over all the parts. Step 1 was putting the axles together. So we're putting the axles together. It's pretty well explained. They tell you which bag to use. Open bag A, open plastic bag 1. All of the bags are clearly labeled. They tell you the parts, the screws, the bearings, the pieces. They have you start with a differential. It's the 3 smallest screws. And the only thing to note, it's metal on metal, so you want to use about 1 drop of thread lock on each screw. Here's the finished differential, or lack of differential since it's a locker. That drops into the axle housing. You've got bearings on either side of the differential. They're the open type. You can see the actual balls in them. The pinion, it's got a big one, a big bearing and a small bearing. These screws hold on the differential cover, which holds everything in place. It's for the longest screws with a regular cap head. Looking at the axles, they start out the same with the axle housing. They get the same differential and the same link mounts. It changes on the ends where one gets steering and the one for the rear gets the straight ends. So taking a note on the front axle, note where the bearings go in. There's one in the axle tube, and then the end of the axle, the C portion goes on, and then there's the actual hub, which has 2 bearings in it. So axle, bearing, C portion, C hub has 2 bearings in it. So here's the bearing in the end of the axle, the C portion, and the hubs have 2 bearings in it. Just take note of where those go. Also on the axle, one of the C hubs has an extra mount. That's for your track bar. Due to the suspension setup on this, the 3-link front with track bar. Of course, the axle shaft goes in the middle. One other thing to note, it's pretty well described here. Caster needs to be set at 10 degrees. So that's referring to the main axle here versus the C portion on the end. Not the, well, the C portion and the steering knuckle. So when you change the pinion angle here of the main section, you can see that we're also changing where the steering C hub and knuckle are. So the pinion gets set about here level, and they want the steering section slightly backward. So the C knuckle part of this, there's splines, and you want to make sure that when you put it onto the splines, it's angled back slightly. From what I can tell, this is about a 1-to-1 picture, so you can tell if you have it set up correctly or not. But caster, if you don't know, it's referring to the angle that that steering knuckle is at. And if you have the caster set up like this, the thing will be very darty. When you start to turn, it'll want to take off and it won't want to stop turning. If you have it set like this, will drive a lot more stable. You need some caster in it. So basically the axle has a splined end, and you need to make sure that you set it up with negative caster. It's hard to see, but holding it level and drawing a line, it's got slightly negative caster. Now, if you start to set the caster too negative, that also messes things up because, well, as you can see, if I adjusted the pinion way down like this, at this point we're turning the tires nearly side to side instead of actually steering them. So we only want it slightly negative, and that will just increase our drivability, make it more stable. So they give a big note here, but this is definitely not something to blow off, just something to make sure that we set it up correctly. So the next couple pages, we've got those screws with a unthreaded part. Those are for holding on the knuckles. On the rear, it's recommending have the screws going in a vertical fashion. I'm going to try to dodge that and have the screws going in a horizontal fashion on the top of the axle, just to keep them more out of the way. I don't think that'll be an issue, but it might be. But this is what I'm going to try. Once again, we want to note the bearing goes into the axle, the main axle housing. So this will be axle shaft, bearing, into the axle housing, then the end. So you can see I've already put the end on this one, and that was incorrect because I didn't put the bearing in. So just once again take note of where the bearings go. And then a note about the link mounts. Those screws look similar to these, except they're shorter. So they have the same style head, the standard head, except they're shorter. And a note on the link mounts, the part that has a little boss is down. Now, following the instructions, it's pretty clearly marked, but the top of the axle has this portion with the holes and the flanges. The bottom is nice and flat, so you know your top from bottom. The link mounts, popular to what you might think, the part with the boss is down. And on the last thing to note, some people like to pack the entire axle tube with grease, and that's just helpful if you plan to drive it in a lot of water. With the axles underwater, you've got water can come leaking through the axle. The theory is the more grease you have in there, the more it will seal. So when I put the front axle together, I forgot about this. I'm going to take it back apart and put more grease in there because I intend to use this thing hard and not shy away from water. So I'm going to fill it up with more grease. The theory being the more grease, the less water can come in, as well as the more it can seal out water. So you can grease stuff such as the screw holes around the edge of the diff cover, in the axle tubes near the bearing, the whole works. Any way that water could come in, you can grease, and that'll help keep the water out for when you're out running around in water. Owning a crawler, you might think, oh yeah, I'll stay out of the water, but when you see that puddle, it can be tempting, and you might wind up in it. So one final note on the axles: any screw that's going into plastic, you do not want to torque it down super tight. In my experience, you can tell when it bottoms out, And from there, you only want to turn it just slightly more, or else you run the risk of stripping it. There's no real torque spec for anything, but just keep in mind it's going into plastic, so do not crank it down. And then the real cool thing about this kit, and this is the first vehicle I've owned that has such a thing. These are helically or spirally cut bevel gears for the differentials, and most of every kit or every model that I have owned has been straight cut bevel gears, which is more what we think about and typically associate with bevel gears. So these are more durable because there's more surface contact between the gears. And these also have a high pinion offset, meaning that instead of the pinion being in the middle of the gear, it's offset toward the top. That's good for clearance. And it's very interesting and unique to see that the manufacturing process has evolved to the point that we can have such advanced gears like this on a budget that's affordable. So it's pretty cool. It's a very unique and new feature. I only know of this model, and the Traxxas X Max had an upgrade to this style gear. So it's just really cool and really unique to see how the industry is changing, and technology is improving, and we're just getting more and more awesome features like this in our cars.